In 1924, a man paid $1,990,000 for the right to drill on 160 acres of Oklahoma prairie. Not for the land, just for the lease. The auction happened outdoors, in the shade of a single elm tree, on a hilltop in a town of 6,000 people. The auctioneer, Colonel Ellsworth Walters, earned $10 a day. The bidders included the founders of Phillips Petroleum, Marland Oil, and Skelly Oil, men who would become some of the richest in American history. And the people who owned what lay beneath that prairie, the people who collected every dollar of every royalty check, were 2,000 members of the Osage Nation. Per capita, they were the wealthiest people on earth, wealthier than the Rockefellers, wealthier than the Carnegies, wealthier than anyone, anywhere. And within a few years, dozens of them would be dead, shot, bombed, poisoned, thrown from trains, killed by a conspiracy so patient and so arithmetic in its logic that it turned the laws of the United States into a murder weapon. This is the story of Pawhuska, Oklahoma, and it is a story about what happens when the richest people in a country are also the most powerless. To understand how the Osage ended up in Pawhuska, you have to understand what they were running from. For centuries, the Osage had been one of the dominant nations of the Great Plains, controlling an enormous territory that stretched across present-day Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma. They were warriors and traders and diplomats. By the early 19th century, though, the familiar machinery of American expansion was grinding westward, and treaty after treaty shrank the Osage homeland down to a reservation in southeastern Kansas. And then even that wasn't enough. White settlers wanted Kansas, too. By 1870, the pressure was unbearable. The Osage agreed to sell their Kansas lands to the United States government for $1.25 an acre. With the proceeds, they did something unusual. They didn't accept land assigned to them. They purchased their own reservation, roughly 1.5 million acres in what was then Indian Territory, bought outright from the Cherokee Nation. It was rocky, hilly, covered in tall grass and blackjack oak, poor soil, terrible for farming. The Osage chose it precisely because they believed no white settler would ever want it. They wanted to be left alone. One elder reportedly said the land was so useless that even the white man would have no reason to take it from them. That was 1872. The Osage Agency was established on Bird Creek, at a place originally called Deep Ford. The town that grew around it would be named Pawhuska, after Chief Pawhuska, White Hair, a leader who, according to Osage tradition, had once tried to scalp an enemy in battle and come away holding the man's white wig instead. He wore the wig for the rest of his life, and the name stuck. For the next 25 years, Pawhuska was a modest settlement on the edge of nowhere. Dirt streets, wooden storefronts, cattlemen negotiating grass leases with an Osage leasing committee for their herds. The first newspaper, the Indian Herald, was founded in 1875 by George Edward Tinker, an Osage journalist. By the 1880s, cattlemen were leasing hundreds of thousands of acres of Osage grassland, 431,000 acres by 1898, over 727,000 by 1901. But the money was modest, the town was quiet, and the Osage lived as they had for generations, raising cattle, hunting in the blackjack timber, practicing their ceremonies in the rolling hills around the agency. In 1896, Chief James Bigheart, one of the most astute political minds in Osage history, a man whose foresight would one day be worth billions, signed the Osage Nation's first oil lease. The lessee was a white businessman named Edwin B. Foster, who, along with his brother Henry, formed the Indian Territory Illuminating Oil Company. The lease covered the entire reservation. The following year, in 1897, a drill bit punched through the red Oklahoma earth and struck oil. Now the Osage had done something else unusual, something that would prove either their greatest blessing or their deepest curse, depending on which decade you were asking about. When the federal government pushed the Osage Allotment Act through Congress in 1906, part of a broader national campaign to break up tribal landholdings and force assimilation, Osage leaders negotiated two provisions that no other tribe in America received. First, the reservation's surface land would be divided only among Osage citizens. No surplus land would be open to outsiders. Each of the 2,229 enrolled members received an average allotment of about 660 acres. Second, and far more consequentially, the subsurface mineral rights would remain the collective property of the entire Osage Nation, not divided, not sold, held in trust forever. This meant that every barrel of oil pulled from beneath Osage County, and Osage County was enormous, larger than the state of Delaware, generated royalties that belonged to the tribe as a whole. Those royalties were divided into 2,229 equal shares, one for each person on the 1906 tribal roll. These shares were called headrights. You could inherit a headright. You could not buy or sell one. Every quarter, the Bureau of Indian Affairs distributed the payments, and as the oil wells multiplied across the county, those quarterly checks began to grow. In 1916, each headright was worth about $2,275. By 1920, it was $9,900. By 1923, it was $11,800. In 1924, the peak year, each headright paid $12,000. The average American family earned somewhere around $1,200 to $1,500 a year. An Osage family of 5, each member holding a headright, collected roughly $60,000 annually. In 1920s money, a single family earning what a successful doctor or a partner in a New York law firm might dream of. And the money was everywhere, visible, impossible to ignore. Osage County had become one of the most prolific oil fields on the planet. The Burbank field, developed in the early 1920s by Ernest Marlin's oil company, alone produced over 103 million barrels by 1926. By 1930, more than 3 dozen separate oil fields existed across the county: Avant, Barnsdall, Skiatook, and a cumulative 319 million barrels of crude had been pumped from the ground. In 1923, the Osage Nation collectively earned more than $30 million in royalties, the equivalent of more than $400 million today. Every dime of it flowed through the headright system to 2,229 people. The Osage built stone mansions with swimming pools and grand pianos. They drove Pierce Arrows and Packard Twin Sixes and Cadillacs, often chauffeured by white drivers. They wore designer clothes from Paris. They adorned themselves with diamonds and furs. They employed white servants, cooks, maids, gardeners, in a reversal of the racial hierarchy that stunned and infuriated white America. One visitor in the early 1920s expressed contempt at the sight of even whites performing all the menial tasks about the house to which no Osage will stoop. Reporters descended on Osage County to marvel at the spectacle. One widely repeated claim held that the average Osage owned 11 automobiles at a time when most Americans could barely afford one. Osage children were sent to the finest boarding schools and universities. Some families traveled to Europe. The nearby town of Fairfax was said to have more luxury automobiles per capita than anywhere else in the nation. Pawhuska swelled. By 1920, the population had reached 6,414, modest by city standards, but the town punched far above its weight. The downtown filled with solid brick commercial buildings, 2 and 3 stories tall, built to last. A 5-story triangle building rose at the intersection of Kiheka Avenue, its wedge shape commanding the streetscape like the prow of a ship. The Osage County Courthouse, completed in 1914 from locally quarried sandstone, anchored Agency Hill with the civic authority of a much larger place. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway extended its line to Pawhuska in 1923, connecting the town to the wider world just as the wealth was cresting. 2 newspapers, the Osage Journal and the Osage County News, chronicled the daily business of a community awash in money. The Immaculate Conception Church rose in stone and stained glass. A swinging pedestrian bridge crossed Bird Creek. Everything was built as though the money would never stop. And up on Agency Hill, between the courthouse and the Osage Tribal Council House, stood the elm tree. It had been planted sometime in the late 19th century, just a shade tree, an ornament for the grounds of the agency. But when the oil lease auctions began there in 1912, it became something else entirely. Colonel Ellsworth Walters, a white auctioneer from Pawnee County, was hired by the Osage Nation to sell mineral leases in 160-acre blocks. He was paid $10 a day. He stood beneath the elm's broad canopy and called bids while the founders of the world's great oil companies, Frank Phillips, Lee Phillips, Wade Phillips, William Skelly, Ernest Marland, raised their hands in the Oklahoma heat. The auction started at 10:30 in the morning and sometimes ran past 9 at night. Walters knew the oilmen intimately and was so skilled at extracting higher bids that, according to one account, L.E. Phillips once bid $100,000 for a lease by brushing a fly from his nose. The Osage awarded Walters a gold medal, a diamond-studded badge, and a diamond ring for his services. The reporters who covered these auctions, watching millions change hands in a single afternoon beneath a single tree in a small town in Oklahoma, gave the tree its name, the Million Dollar Elm. 18 separate 160-acre tracts sold for bonuses exceeding $1 million each. On March 18, 1924, the opening bid on one tract was $1 million. The next day, a tract went for $1,990,000 in the shade of an elm tree in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. But here is the part of the story that was already unfolding, quietly, beneath the prosperity, the part that would come to define this place forever. The headright system had a design flaw, and it was lethal. Headrights could be inherited, and they could be inherited by anyone, Osage or not. If an Osage woman with a headright married a white man and then died, her headright passed to her legal heirs, which could include her white husband. If her mother also died, and her mother's headright had been willed to her, that headright too would pass along. Each death in a family concentrated more wealth in fewer hands. For anyone with a talent for arithmetic and a tolerance for murder, the headright system was not a protection. It was an invitation. And then the federal government made it worse. In 1921, Congress passed a law establishing a guardianship system for the Osage. Any Osage person with half or more tribal blood could be declared legally incompetent by a county probate judge, not for any demonstrated incapacity, but simply because they were Osage. Once declared incompetent, they were assigned a white guardian who controlled their headright income. The guardian decided what they could buy, how much they could withdraw, what bills would be paid. Restricted Osage received $1,000 per quarter for living expenses, but that money was quickly consumed by the guardian's own fees, lawyer charges, and inflated invoices for everything from car repairs to groceries. County judges appointed their friends as guardians. Many guardians took on multiple Osage wards, multiplying the fees. It was a system of patronage dressed as protection. As one historian put it, this was not something people did out of the goodness of their hearts. It was a way of making a living by largely doing very little. The Osage, in possession of wealth that would have made them among the most powerful people in the country, were reduced to asking permission to spend their own money. One government study later estimated that before 1925, guardians had stolen at least $8 million directly from restricted Osage accounts. And that was just the documented theft, the invoices filed, the fees charged. The deeper exploitation, the day-to-day indignity of a wealthy woman who needed her guardian's signature to buy her own groceries, left no paper trail at all. Harper's Monthly summed up the prevailing white attitude in a single sentence. The Osage Indians are becoming so rich that something will have to be done about it. Something was done. And the man who did the most was already in place, waiting. William King Hale was born in Hunt County, Texas on Christmas Eve, 1874. He arrived in what would become Osage County around 1900, a young cowboy looking for opportunity. He found it. Over the next 2 decades, Hale built himself into the most powerful white man in the county. He accumulated ranch land, tens of thousands of acres, through a combination of leases, deals, and, according to persistent local legend, insurance fraud. The story went that he insured his pasture land for $1 an acre and then ordered his ranch hands to torch 30,000 acres in a single night. Whether or not that particular tale is true, the pattern it describes is consistent with everything else Hale did. He was a man who understood systems, legal systems, financial systems, social systems, and who bent them until they served him. He cultivated friendships with the Osage. He attended their ceremonies. He wrote letters to tribal leaders declaring, "I never had better friends in my life than the Osages. I will always be the Osages' true friend." He donated to local causes. He positioned himself as a benefactor, a protector, a pillar of the community. The people of Osage County called him the King of the Osage Hills, and he did not discourage them. By the early 1920s, Hale had amassed substantial wealth and political influence. He had banking interests, business connections, relationships with judges and lawyers and lawmen throughout the county. But he wanted more, and he had devised a plan to get it, a plan that was, in its cold financial logic, almost elegant. Hale had a nephew named Ernest Burkhart, a young man from Greenville, Texas, who had come to Osage County around 1912, drawn by the oil boom. Hale encouraged Ernest to marry an Osage woman named Molly Kyle. Molly was a full-blood Osage, an original Alati, and the holder of a headright. She lived with her mother, Lizzie Q. Kyle, in the town of Fairfax, about 20 miles from Pawhuska. Ernest and Molly married in 1917. Molly's family was large. Her mother, Lizzie, held multiple headrights, her own, plus those she had inherited from a deceased husband and 2 daughters who had died before the murders began. Molly had 3 sisters, Minnie, Anna, and Rita. Each held her own headright. The family's combined oil income was staggering. Hale understood the arithmetic. If the family members died in the right order, sisters first, then the mother, then all the headrights would funnel to the surviving sister. And if the surviving sister happened to be married to his nephew, and if she, too, eventually died, the headrights would pass to Ernest. And from Ernest, by one mechanism or another, to Hale. It was a business plan, a liquidation strategy, and Hale executed it with patience. In 1918, Molly's younger sister Minnie, 27 years old and seemingly healthy, died of what doctors called a wasting illness. It attracted little attention at the time. Years later, investigators would conclude she had likely been poisoned. On May 22, 1921, Molly's sister Anna Brown was found dead in a ravine north of Fairfax, shot in the back of the head. She had been missing for a week. A boy out squirrel hunting had stumbled upon the decomposing body, identified by its gold fillings and the blanket wrapped around it. 2 local doctors, the brothers James and David Schoen, performed an autopsy. The local coroner initially ruled her death as the result of whiskey poisoning, an absurdity given the bullet wound clearly visible in her skull. Brian Burkhart, Ernest's brother, was initially arrested and charged. He had been the last person seen with Anna alive, having offered to drive her home after a night of drinking, but he was acquitted, and the case went silent. No serious investigation followed. The death of a wealthy Osage woman, shot execution style and dumped in a ravine, simply faded from the docket. 2 months later, in July 1921, Lizzie Q. Kyle died at the home of her daughter Molly and son-in-law Ernest Burkhart. Poison was suspected, but never proven. At the time of her death, Lizzie possessed headrights that were collectively worth a fortune. Those headrights now passed to her 2 surviving daughters, Molly and Rita. Through the summer and fall, other Osage died. William Stepson, a 29-year-old, of poisoning. Joe Grayhorse, found dead. Anna Sanford, found dead. The deaths accumulated like entries in a ledger. In February 1923, the body of Henry Roan was found in the front seat of his car in a rocky ravine northwest of Fairfax. Henry Roan was a full-blood Osage, 6 feet tall, a man who wore his hair in long plaits in the traditional style. He had been shot once in the back of the head. His car was sitting in the open, the body left where it fell. Investigators eventually discovered that William Hale had taken out a $25,000 life insurance policy on Roan, with Hale himself listed as the beneficiary. Hale had lent Roan $1,200 and used the debt as a pretext to arrange the policy, with one of the Schoen brothers signing the medical authorization. Hale had also previously attempted to purchase Roan's headright outright, but a change in the law that would have allowed such a sale had failed to pass. When the legal route didn't work, Hale chose the other one. With Roan's death, the fear among the Osage reached a kind of fever pitch. Families lighted their homes through the night. Dogs were kept close as a measure of protection. People wondered openly, who would be next? And then came the night that finally made the nation pay attention. Bill Smith was one of the most outspoken Osage demanding justice for the murders. He had appeared before the tribal council to call for action. When some in the crowd suggested an evil spirit was stalking the community, Smith stood up and said, "No, There is no evil spirit except one in human form. When someone asked him to name the murderer, he stayed silent. He knew. He just couldn't prove it. In the days before March 10th, 1923, the dogs in the Smith family's Fairfax neighborhood began dying, poisoned one by one. On the night of March 9th, Bill Smith drove his Studebaker home from following an investigative lead. His wife, Rita, Molly's sister, was waiting for him. Their white servant, 17-year-old Nettie Brookshire, was spending the night. At 2:50 in the morning, a blast tore the Smith house apart. 5 gallons of nitroglycerin had been placed beneath it. Rita and Nettie were killed instantly. Pieces of their bodies were later found plastered against a house 300 feet away. Bill Smith was pulled from the wreckage, burned almost beyond recognition, and lingered for 4 days. Before he died, he made a statement. "I only had 2 enemies in the world. They are Bill Hale and Ernest Burkhart." With Rita dead, every headright that had once belonged to 4 sisters and their mother now concentrated in a single person. Molly Burkhart, Ernest Burkhart's wife, William Hale's niece by marriage. And Molly was already sick. She had been receiving insulin injections from 2 Fairfax physicians, the brothers James and David Shune. The injections, investigators would later conclude, almost certainly contained poison. Day by day, Molly was being drained of life, slowly, so that it might look natural, so that no one would connect it to the other deaths. By the summer of 1923, the toll had become impossible to ignore, even for those who had been trying. Over 24 Osage had been murdered or died under suspicious circumstances in the span of about 2 years. The Osage Tribal Council met in March 1923 and made a formal appeal to Washington. The situation, they said, was beyond what any local authority could or would handle. After the Smith bombing, the tribal chieftain declared, "We must appeal to the white father in Washington. Our people are being murdered." But the conspiracy reached even those who tried to expose it. George Bigheart, an Osage man, and the son of the legendary Chief James Bigheart, the same chief who had negotiated the mineral rights clause that made the Osage wealthy, fell ill after drinking what investigators later believed was poisoned whiskey. Hale and Burkhart arranged to put Bigheart on a train to Oklahoma City for hospital treatment. At the hospital, Bigheart asked to see his attorney, W. Vaughn, and shared information about the murders. Vaughn left the hospital and boarded a train back. His body was found the next day beside the railroad tracks outside Pawhuska. He had been thrown from the moving train. Bigheart died in the hospital shortly after. A white oilman named Barney McBride, who had traveled all the way to Washington to urge a federal investigation, was found in a culvert in Maryland, stabbed more than 20 times. The message was clear. Anyone who tried to uncover the truth became a target. And with dense forests, vast stretches of inaccessible canyons, and a county the size of Delaware, Osage County was an ideal place to make people disappear. In March 1923, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs requested the assistance of the Bureau of Investigation, a small and still somewhat obscure arm of the Justice Department. The Bureau was struggling. Its early agents had a mixed record and public confidence was low. In 1924, a 29-year-old administrator named J. Edgar Hoover was appointed its director and immediately began trying to professionalize the agency. He recognized the Osage case as both a moral crisis and an institutional opportunity. If the Bureau could solve these murders, it would prove its value to the nation. If it failed, the scandal could end Hoover's career before it began. In July 1925, Hoover assigned the case to Tom White, a former Texas Ranger who had been born in a log cabin on the Texas frontier. White was an old-school lawman, tall, methodical, experienced, but he had evolved with the times. He understood modern investigative techniques, fingerprinting, handwriting analysis, the patient assembly of documentary evidence. He wore a suit now instead of chaps, filed paperwork instead of drawing a sidearm, but he still carried the instincts of a man who had spent years tracking fugitives through brush country. White arrived in Oklahoma City and assembled a small undercover team of 4 agents. One was a Native American whose identity was never publicly disclosed. The others included John Berger, Frank Smith, and John Wren. His men posed as cattlemen, oil prospectors, and insurance salesmen. moving through Osage County with plausible cover stories, listening in barbershops and hotel lobbies, cultivating informants, and most importantly, following money. White held regular meetings where the team compared observations, and one name kept recurring in every thread they pulled. And the money led, as it always does, to William Hale. White's agents methodically connected the dots. They traced Hale's $25,000 insurance policy on Henry Roan and discovered that one of the Shun brothers, James, had been willing to provide the medical approval for the policy. They pieced together the inheritance chain of the Kyle family murders. Anna first, then Lizzie, then Rita, each death sending headrights upward to the surviving heirs, concentrating them in Molly, who was married to Ernest, who was controlled by Hale. They linked Hale's employees to the bombing of the Smith house. They connected a petty criminal named Kelsey Morrison to the murder of Anna Brown. They discovered that the Shun brothers' injections of Molly Burkhart were almost certainly poison, administered on Hale's instructions. And they found that Hale had also tried to purchase Henry Roan's headright outright, but a change in the law that would have allowed such a sale had failed to pass. When the legal route didn't work, Hale had simply arranged Roan's death and collected on the insurance instead. The breakthrough came in January 1926 when warrants were issued for the arrest of William Hale and Ernest Burkhart. At the time of his arrest, Hale's worth was estimated at $500,000, a fortune built on cattle, insurance fraud, and the systematic exploitation of his Osage neighbors. Under pressure, Ernest confessed. He described his uncle's scheme in detail, how Hale had recruited accomplices, bribed jail guards to release a convicted burglar to commit murders, arranged the bombing, orchestrated the poisoning. Ernest revealed that Hale had enlisted a cattle thief named Henry Grammer to find a man willing to plant the nitroglycerin beneath the Smith house. Grammer himself had died in a suspicious car accident in June 1923. His brakes may have been tampered with, eliminating a key witness before any investigation could reach him. Morrison, already in prison on other charges, confessed that he had shot Anna Brown on Hale's orders. What followed was not the swift justice anyone might have expected. Between June 1926 and November 1929, the defendants were tried in state and federal courts in Guthrie, Oklahoma City, Pawhuska, and Bartlesville. The trials were a spectacle that drew national newspaper and magazine coverage, but the proceedings were marked by deadlocked juries, overturned verdicts, legal delays, and the intimidation and disappearance of witnesses. The first federal trial of Hale and his co-conspirator John Ramsey, held in Pawhuska for the murder of Henry Roan, ended in a hung jury after 5 days of deliberation and 64 ballots. The federal district attorney, Roy St. Louis, was bitter. There are some good men on the jury, and I'm inclined to think there are some not so good, he told reporters. I have heard whisperings from Oklahoma City and Tulsa. Local prejudice ran deep, and the corruption of the county ran deeper. Getting a white jury in Osage County to convict a white man for the murder of an Osage person was, as one federal prosecutor observed, an exercise in fighting a system that did not believe the crimes were really crimes. Hale's defense team painted him as a friend of the Osage, a benefactor, a pillar of the community being persecuted by overreaching federal agents. The retrial moved to Oklahoma City, where the prosecution's case was tighter, the witnesses more focused, and the jury less entangled in the local power structure. Ernest Burkhart pleaded guilty in June 1926 and received a life sentence for the murder of Bill Smith. Kelsey Morrison received a life sentence for the murder of Anna Brown. In January 1929, after multiple trials and one overturned verdict, William Hale was finally convicted of the murder of Henry Roan and sentenced to life in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas. Hale never admitted to anything. He spent nearly 2 decades in Leavenworth, much of it working on a prison pig farm. In a peculiar turn, the warden of Leavenworth during part of Hale's incarceration was Tom White, the very agent who had put him there. White reportedly insisted that Hale be treated like any other prisoner. On July 31, 1947, William Hale was paroled. He had served 18 years of a life sentence for a conspiracy that killed at least 24 people, though the true number was almost certainly far higher. As a condition of his release, he was barred from returning to Oklahoma. He drifted to Montana, where he worked as a cowboy and a dishwasher at a drive-in restaurant. He eventually moved to Arizona. Before leaving prison, He had written a letter expressing his wish to return to Osage County. "I had rather live at Gray Horse than any place on earth," he said. He died in a nursing home in Phoenix on August 15, 1962, at the age of 87, possessing none of the wealth he had once schemed to acquire. His relatives later reported that he had once said, "If that damn Ernest had kept his mouth shut, we'd be rich today." Ernest Burkhart was paroled in 1937, but was sent back to prison after burglarizing the home of a former sister-in-law. He was released again in 1959 and pardoned by Oklahoma Governor Henry Bellman in 1966, despite formal protests from the Osage Nation. He spent his remaining years in a trailer outside Osage County, living with his brother Brian. He died in 1986 at 94 in what one writer described as a mice-infested trailer. His ashes were scattered in the Osage Hills. Molly Burkhart survived. When Ernest was arrested and the poisoning stopped, she recovered from her mysterious illness. She divorced Ernest in 1926. She married a man named John Cobb in 1928 and lived the rest of her life in Osage County. She never fully recovered from the loss of every member of her immediate family. Her mother, all three sisters, killed one by the family she had married into. But she lived, and her children inherited her estate. That inheritance was the one thing the conspiracy failed to steal. Here is what is hardest to absorb about this story, and what matters most: the murders that were investigated and prosecuted. The Kyle family, Henry Roan, the Smith bombing, were not the full extent of the killing. They were not even close. The Bureau of Investigation's official count was 24 Osage murdered during the Reign of Terror. The Osage Nation and other researchers have estimated the number at around 60. Some historians believe it was higher still, that across the 1910s, 1920s, and into the 1930s, the total number of Osage killed for their headrights reached into the hundreds. The reason the true number may never be known is that most of the deaths were never investigated. Coroners ruled gunshot wounds as accidents. Poisonings were listed as natural causes. Bodies found in ravines were attributed to exposure or alcohol. The local legal system, the same system that appointed white guardians to manage Osage money, the same system that staffed its juries with white men who owed their livelihoods to the oil economy, had no interest in looking too closely at what was happening. As David Grann wrote in his book on the murders, these cases underscored that the murders of the Osage for their headrights were not the result of a single conspiracy orchestrated by Hale. He might have led the bloodiest and longest killing spree, but there were countless other killings that were not included in official estimates and that were never investigated or even classified as homicides. The Osage, in other words, were not the victims of one evil man. They were the victims of a system in which white people controlled their money, white people served as their guardians, white people sat on the juries, white people appointed the judges, and white people stood to inherit their wealth when they died. The guardianship laws, the inheritance rules, the probate courts, the local law enforcement that looked the other way. William Hale was the most ambitious and most ruthless participant in this system, but he was not its architect. The system existed before he arrived, and it continued to operate after he went to prison. In 1925, in belated response to the murders, Congress passed a law prohibiting the transfer of Osage headrights to non-Osage individuals from tribal members with more than half Osage blood. It was a partial fix, too late for the dead. The guardianship system continued for years afterward, and the financial exploitation of the Osage did not end with the Reign of Terror. It merely became less violent. By the late 1920s, the Osage oil boom was fading. Production peaked and began its long decline. The headright payment that had reached $12,000 in 1924 fell to $3,010 by 1929 and bottomed out at $498 in 1933. A staggering collapse from wealth beyond imagination to less than the price of a used automobile in barely 9 years. The Great Depression hollowed out Pawhuska the way it hollowed out 1,000 other small American towns. But in Pawhuska, the decline carried the weight of all that had come before. The population slipped from 6,414 in 1920 to 5,931 in 1930, then to 5,443 in 1940, 5,331 in 1950, and it never recovered. A creamery, a brick plant, an ice factory, and a rock crusher replaced the oil wealth, industries that employed people but didn't make anyone rich, and certainly didn't draw the founders of petroleum empires to bid under elm trees on summer afternoons. The downtown's brick buildings, 98 of them, 86 eventually placed on the National Register of Historic Places, stood like monuments to an era that had burned through town in barely a decade. By November 1969, the Osage lands had produced 1 billion barrels of oil, and it was estimated that perhaps 2 billion more remained beneath the surface. But the easy money was gone. The boomtowns had gone quiet, and the men who had made fortunes had long since moved their offices to Tulsa and Oklahoma City. The elm tree on Agency Hill eventually died of Dutch elm disease sometime in the 1980s. A replacement was planted in 2014. That tree, too, was felled in 2024. Today, a monument marks the spot where Colonel Walters once stood in the shade, calling bids while the founders of oil dynasties brushed flies from their noses and spent nearly $2 million on a quarter section of prairie. By the 2020 census, Pawhuska's population was 2,984. The downtown, with its triangle building and its sandstone courthouse and its shoulder-to-shoulder brick facades, looks remarkably intact, a physical record of the years when this town was the financial epicenter of one of the most extraordinary wealth events in American history. In 2016, Ree Drummond, the television personality known as the Pioneer Woman, opened a restaurant and store called the Mercantile in a 100-year-old building on the main street. And tourists now drive from across the country to eat pancakes and buy cast-iron skillets in a town most of them had never heard of. The Osage Nation Museum, founded in 1938 and the oldest tribally owned museum in the United States, sits a short walk away. The Osage Nation itself, headquartered in Pawhuska, as it has been since 1872, continues to govern its reservation, still the largest county in Oklahoma, still sitting atop oil and gas reserves that, while diminished, still generate headright payments. In 2022, each headright paid $26,085. The Osage endured. They endured removal. They endured poverty. They endured the paradox of being the richest people on earth and unable to write a check without a white man's signature. They endured the murder of their families and the mockery of their grief by courts that treated their deaths as regrettable but unremarkable incidents. They endured watching the man who orchestrated the killing of their relatives get paroled after 18 years and walk free. And when Hale returned to Fairfax briefly after his release, a man convicted of arranging the murder of Osage people, a man banned from the state of Oklahoma, townspeople gathered to greet him. "The word went around town, 'Bill Hale is here,'" recalled one Osage elder, "and people gathered as if there was a parade." That is maybe the fact that stays with you longest. Not the nitroglycerin, not the poison, not the forged insurance policies. The parade. The Osage bought that land because they thought nobody would want it, and they were right. Nobody wanted the land. What people wanted was what was underneath it, and to get it, they built a legal system that stripped the Osage of control over their own lives, and then they killed whoever was standing between them and the money. The land that was supposed to be their refuge became their trap. The wealth that should have been their power became the instrument of their destruction. The headright system that was designed to keep the mineral estate in Osage hands created a financial incentive to ensure that certain Osage no longer had hands to hold it. Somewhere in Pawhuska, on Agency Hill, between the sandstone courthouse and the Osage Council House, a stump sits where the elm used to be. Millions of dollars flowed through the shade of that tree. Enough money to build cities, enough money to buy anything the 20th century had to sell. The men who bid under it became billionaires. The people who owned the oil became the wealthiest community per capita in human history. And the system built around that wealth, the leases, the guardianships, the inheritance rules, the probate courts, was so perfectly designed for exploitation that it turned ordinary greed into mass murder, and the murder into something the law could barely bring itself to notice. The elm is gone now. The money is quieter. The brick buildings on Keheka Avenue still stand, warm in the Oklahoma sun, built by people who expected the boom to last forever and had no idea what it was already costing. Tourists come for the cinnamon rolls. A few of them walk up the hill to read the marker. The ground beneath their feet is still Osage,